I'm delighted to be here today. It's a beautiful day in Hanover. I have not been to Dartmouth for a very long time, and I'm delighted to be able to introduce the beautiful town and academic community to my husband and son who are touring this morning while I'm talking with you. They've heard all this before. My poor 16-year-old son has to listen at the dinner table to endless conversations between me and my husband, who is one of the honest guys on Wall Street. He trades government bonds. So my poor 16-year-old son has to listen to these unending conversations about the corruption on Wall Street. And finally, he just throws up his hands and says, "I give up, they're talking finance again." Anyway, much more fun for them to tour outside on a beautiful day than listen to me. I was really delighted to be invited. There was no attack dog that needed to be sent because the theme of your program this summer is so on point, I think, with a lot of what I have been writing at the paper and certainly with some of my colleagues there, particularly my partner in crime, Louise Story. She and I have done a lot of work on trying to understand why there have been so few prosecutions of the participants and possible perpetrators in the great financial crisis that exploded in 2008. One of the reasons that we decided to tackle this topic is because it really is a persistent question that I get over and over again. Repeatedly, my questioners ask me, for years after the credit crisis that brought the American economy to the brink, why is it that no one has gone to jail as a result? My questioners and I find it hard to believe that a debacle of this magnitude, which generated hundreds of billions in losses, jettisoned millions from their homes, and threw our nation into a recession, involved zero criminal activity. Now, I know it's undoubtedly true that criminal cases take a long time to mount. I am not a prosecutor, I am not a lawyer, but I do know that. And it's entirely possible that additional indictments and prison sentences will be forthcoming. But at last count, only one relatively high-level mortgage banking official has been sentenced to jail time in a case arising out of the meltdown. His name is Lee Farkas, and he led a $3 billion fraud while running a lender called Taylor, Bean, and Whitaker, according to prosecutors. He was recently sentenced to 30 years in prison for his crime. Taylor, Bean, and who, you might ask? You'd be right, because neither Mr. Farkas nor his company were major participants in the credit bubble. Among the big Wall Street banks that were so central to the crisis, only one person has been targeted by the Securities and Exchange Commission. Fabrice Tour, a 32-year-old Frenchman who was a junior person on Goldman Sachs's mortgage trading desk. And Fabrice's is not a criminal case. Yes, the fact that so few people have been held accountable for this particular mess by the summer of 2011 is disturbing to many people. Is it really that difficult to hold the perpetrators of this disaster responsible? Or maybe there's something more pernicious at work, perhaps a concerted effort to protect some of the primary players from prosecution. This is not an idle thought. Given that so many high-powered people were involved in the questionable practices that led to the crisis, many of them, of course, hailing from Wall Street and Washington, digging too deeply into the mess could touch some mighty participants. One well might ask whether the government really wants to identify who did what during this episode. given that regulators such as the Federal Reserve, the Office of Thrift Supervision, the Comptroller of the Currency, and the SEC allowed poisonous lending to go on and also freed up bank balance sheets to greater risk-taking in the years leading up to the crisis, a hard-nosed government investigator could very well easily wind up probing one of his or her own. It is my belief that many people in Washington know that if they launched a full-blown investigation of this meltdown, the spotlight could easily fall on them. Dennis Bacco, who was an attorney general in the state of New York in the 1990s, spoke to this potential problem when he told the Times that the government might not like the high places that deep investigations would lead them to. Quote, "It's not just one 30-year-old wunderkind who was responsible for the financial crisis," he said. Once you start pulling the string through in these complex cases, you might be surprised what you find at the other end. In fact, several important factors seem to be at work in limiting the number of prosecutions that we've seen so far. One, I think, is the contention by some at the highest levels of government that in-depth investigations of wrongdoing during the mania and afterwards could undermine the stability of the financial system. This approach seems to have dominated the mindset in Washington in the fall of 2008, when world markets shuddered, and may have contributed to a critical slowdown in investigations. One example of this occurred in mid-October of that year when Tim Geithner, who was then president of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, had a meeting with Andrew Cuomo, New York's Attorney General at the time. At the Fed, which oversees the nation's largest banks, Mr. Geithner worked with Treasury Secretary Hank Paulson on TARP, the big bailout fund for banks. He also led efforts to shore up the beleaguered insurer, AIG, that had disastrously insured billions of Wall Street's mortgage securities against default. Mr. Geithner had a focus stabilizing world financial markets. When the meeting took place, Mr. Cuomo was gaining a reputation as something of a Wall Street sheriff. He had been questioning banks and ratings agencies aggressively for more than a year about their roles in the growing debacle. He was investigating rich bonuses granted to executives at AIG. The two men had been friends since their days working in the Clinton administration. Mr. Geithner and Mr. Cuomo convened in the Attorney General's office in Lower Manhattan, just steps from Wall Street and the New York Fed. There, Mr. Geithner expressed concern about the fragility of the financial system. His worry, according to people who had been briefed on the meeting afterwards, sprang from a desire to calm the markets, a goal that a hard-driving Attorney General might complicate. While this fear might certainly have been justified at the time, that perilous moment, you recall it, I'm sure, slowing down investigations into wrongdoing seems to have led to the place where we are now, with few participants under investigation and even fewer in jail. As the clock ticks, the cases become harder to make. Our current situation, by the way, stands in stark contrast to what happened in the early 1990s after the savings and loan debacle, where hundreds of banks failed. In the wake of that mess, special government task forces referred 1,100 cases to prosecutors, resulting in more than 800 bank officials going to jail. There's another key difference between then and now. Many of these jailbirds were chief executive officers, not lower-level flunkies. Among the best known, Charles Keating, CEO of Lincoln Savings in Arizona, and David Paul, head of Centrust Bank in Florida. And here's a third data point that I find interesting because of its contrast to today. In the early 1990s, President Bush made it clear that ferreting out financial fraud at the S&Ls was a top priority of his administration. In speeches, he directed the Justice Department to make these cases vigorously. Fast forward to the current crisis, and we find the opposite approach. In the spring of 2008, just as the tsunami was gathering, the FBI decided to scale back a plan to assign more field agents to investigate mortgage fraud. That summer, just weeks before the collapse of Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, Lehman, and AIG, the Department of Justice also rejected calls to create a task force devoted to mortgage-related investigations. Instead, it left these complex cases understaffed and poorly funded. Only much later did the Justice Department establish a more general financial crimes task force. So why have there been so few successful prosecutions recently? Some prosecutors maintain, of course, that the types of fraud perpetrated during the S&L crisis were far easier to litigate. Those kinds of cases were characterized by embezzlement and self-dealing and other bad behavior that was more easily identified and exposed. Now, Wall Street likes to create complexity, as we know, and there's no doubt that the securities involved in the losses this time around were far more convoluted and impenetrable for investigators accustomed to working on street crime cases. Prosecutorial incompetence, in fact, is probably also at work here. The criminal case against two Bear Stearns executives, for example, whose funds collapsed amid the mortgage meltdown, is a good example. There, prosecutors relied on emails to persuade the jury that the executives had known about the coming crash and sold their personal stock holdings in advance. But the very same emails contained exculpatory language that the prosecutors did not introduce, mystifyingly, which, of course, the defense attorneys were only too happy to do. This kind of prosecutorial ineptitude is disturbing, to say the least. But one of the most crucial and compelling pieces of this non-prosecution puzzle, we think, involves the impact of regulatory failures. Indeed, investigators and regulators ignored past lessons about how to crack financial fraud. What fascinates me about this is how it illustrates the significance of aggressive and astute regulators. We all know that banking overseers failed to rein in the dubious practices in the years leading up to the financial crisis. This failure, of course, had dire consequences for the millions of borrowers who were lured into toxic loans that they could not repay, and the failure also had grave implications for the taxpayers, who then had to bail out these reckless institutions. But the regulatory incompetence during the mania also plays a critical role in the dearth of prosecutions now, it turns out. What many prosecutors have told me is that regulators also failed in their duties to compile the kind of information that traditionally has helped build criminal cases. In effect, the same dynamic that helped to enable the crisis, weak regulation, also made it harder to pursue fraud in its aftermath. Now, how important are regulatory referrals to prosecutions? Once again, let's go back to the S&L crisis. At that time, the FBI opened 5,500 criminal investigations using regulatory referrals. And as I mentioned a moment ago, by 1992, there had been 1,100 criminal prosecutions of major bank fraud, resulting in 839 convictions of bank employees and executives. Certainly, a more aggressive mindset among regulators could have spurred far more prosecutions this time, according to officials who were involved in the S&L cleanup. One of those is William Black, a professor of law at the University of Missouri in Kansas City. He was the federal government's director of litigation during the savings and loan crisis. He told me that the relaxed regulatory approach in the current episode, quote, created an exceptional criminogenic environment. There were no criminal referrals from regulators, he said, no fraud working groups, no national task force. There has been no effective punishment of the elites here, he said. Mr. Black is, I'm afraid, correct. This time around, we have had no task forces, little money, and a puzzling silence from the highest levels of government. Michael Mukasey, a former federal judge in New York who had been head of the Justice Department less than a year when Bear Stearns fell in March 2008, at that time discussed setting up a task force with his deputies, according to 3 people who were briefed on the discussions. But Mr. Mukasey decided against it, announcing that decision publicly in June of 2008. 2 months later, Fannie and Freddie collapsed, Lehman Brothers went bankrupt, and AIG was bailed out. Now, there have been some attempts to put some money into investigations. For example, 2 years into the crisis, Congress passed the Fraud Enforcement and Recovery Act, allocating $165 million to the Justice Department and FBI for new financial fraud cases. Later, however, Congress quietly took away all but $30 million of that allocation. Even civil actions by the government have been limited. We've been talking previously here about criminal cases, but civil actions also send an important message. In 2009, for example, the SEC adopted a broad guideline that was never made public that advised caution when pushing for hefty penalties from banks that had received bailout money. The agency was concerned about taxpayer money in effect being used to pay for settlements, according to people who spoke with officials about the policy. All of these actions contributed to our current and very frustrating situation, where participants in one of the biggest economic disasters in history seem to have skated away from the scene untouched. Equally disturbing, the failure to put resources into law enforcement on these cases confirms a dangerous suspicion that many Americans hold, that there are 2 sets of rules in our nation. One for bankers, highly connected and politically powerful people, and one for the rest of us. To be sure, Wall Street's role in the crisis is complex, and cases related to mortgage securities are immensely technical. Criminal intent is particularly difficult to prove, and banks defend their actions with documents that they say demonstrate that nothing that they did was illegal. This is the mistakes were made argument. But experts point to numerous questionable activities where criminal probes might have borne fruit. Why, for instance, haven't people examined the failure of executives to fully disclose the scope of the risks on their books during the mortgage mania? Or the amounts of questionable loans that they bundled into securities and sold to investors that later soured? Prosecutors might also pursue evidence that executives knowingly awarded bonuses to themselves and colleagues based on overly optimistic valuations of mortgage assets, in effect creating illusory profits that were wiped out by subsequent losses on the same assets. They might also investigate whether executives cashed in shares based on inside information or misled regulators and their own boards about looming problems. Merrill Lynch, remember, understated its risky mortgage holdings by hundreds of billions of dollars. And public comments made by Angelo Mozillo, the co-founder and chief executive of Countrywide, praising his mortgage company's practices, were at odds with derisive statements that he made privately in emails as he sold millions of shares. That stock subsequently fell sharply, of course, as the company's losses became known to the market. But Mr. Mozillo sold $500 million worth of stock during the late stages of the mania. Executives at Lehman Brothers also assured investors in the summer of 2008 that the company's financial position was sound, even though they appeared to have counted as assets certain holdings that they had pledged to other companies. At Bear Stearns, the first major Wall Street player to collapse, a private litigant says evidence shows that the firm's mortgage executives may have pocketed revenues that should have gone to investors to offset losses when those complex securities went bad. But the Justice Department has decided not to pursue some of these matters, including possible criminal charges against Mr. Mozillo of Countrywide, one of the nation's largest subprime lenders. This decision has perplexed many, both inside and outside of law enforcement, given Mr. Mozillo's condemnation of his company's lending practices that emerged in emails uncovered by regulators. But there appears to be more to the dearth of prosecutions than simple, albeit distressing, regulatory ineptitude. Another element at work is the increased collaboration or even coziness between prosecutors and their targets. This can take several forms. One example of this kind of collaboration involves prosecutors teaming up with industry groups. Hearken back with me to early March 2007, when the subprime mortgage meltdown was just beginning. A month later, New Century, one of the most egregious lenders, would file for bankruptcy. But on March 8th of that year, the FBI announced that it was joining forces with, are you ready for this? The Mortgage Bankers Association, the industry lobbying group. They were joining together to battle mortgage fraud. That's right. To identify and pursue fraud, prosecutors had decided to team up with the lobbying arm of the very industry that was creating toxic mortgages. And yet, at the time the announcement was made, there was nary a ripple. I'd like to quote from the press release announcing this historic joint effort. Quote, combating significant fraud in this area is a priority because mortgage lending and the housing market have a significant overall effect on the nation's economy, the FBI said. We work closely with national associations such as the mortgage bankers, as well as with individual lenders, in a continual effort to define and combat the growing mortgage fraud problem. The announcement was a virtual love fest between prosecutors and industry. We wish to thank the FBI for working with us to provide mortgage lenders another item in the toolbox to help combat fraud against lenders, said the chairman of the Mortgage Bankers Association, John Robbins. And Karen Spangenberg, section chief of the Financial Crimes Unit of the Criminal Investigative Division, responded this way: "The FBI is pleased to have worked with the Mortgage Bankers Association as we continue to strengthen our relationship with such key organizations to combat mortgage fraud." Feeling any better about this increased collaboration? But even more troubling than this type of collaboration is another that has probably resulted in fewer prosecutions, and that is the heavier reliance among law enforcement officials on a process known as deferred prosecution. These arrangements give prosecutors an option beyond guilty or not guilty for their targets when they find wrongdoing. The agreements encourage companies to investigate and report their own wrongdoing and give these companies credit with leniency when they do so. In return for cooperation, the government enters into agreements to either delay or cancel the prosecution if the companies promise to change their behavior. Deferred prosecutions became an increasingly popular option in 2004 and 2005 after the Justice Department's pursuit of Arthur Andersen, the accounting firm that had vetted Enron's books. But it wasn't until the summer of 2008, just once again as the financial storm was brewing, that the Justice Department made deferred prosecution agreements a formal alternative for its employees to use when bringing cases. Up until that time, it had only been an informal opportunity. At the time, Sullivan and Cromwell, the white shoe Wall Street law firm that defends many of the large banks, described the shift to its clients as, quote, an important step away from the more aggressive prosecutorial practices seen in some cases under their predecessors. The Securities and Exchange Commission also added its own type of deferred prosecutions to its practices last year and has embraced another alternative to litigation. These are reports that chronicle wrongdoing at institutions like Moody's Investors Service, the credit ratings agency, but often without meting out any punishment. The financial crisis cases brought by the SEC, like a recent settlement with J.P. Morgan Chase for selling a mortgage security that soured, have rarely named executives as defendants. The big banks have welcomed these changes, of course. So did the legal firms that represent them. Now, there are some benefits to deferred prosecutions. One, of course, is that they help our very strapped government do investigations at a lower cost while still potentially identifying wrongdoing. One of the best arguments for deferred prosecutions is that they do not wipe out entire companies and eliminate the jobs of thousands of innocent people, as the indictment of Arthur Andersen did. But some former prosecutors are growing increasingly critical of this reliance on deferred prosecutions. Mary Ramirez, a professor of law at Washburn University, is one of them. She said that deferred prosecutions run the risk of letting companies off too easily. Here is what she told the Times. If you do not punish crimes, there's really no reason they won't happen again. I worry, and so do a lot of economists, that we have created no disincentives for committing fraud or white-collar crime, particularly in the financial space. In a recent paper, Ms. Ramirez argued that inadequate law enforcement against corporate criminals actually created perverse incentives that led to the economic crisis. She said the Justice Department should institute important reforms to pursue corporate crimes much more aggressively and efficiently. A problem with the current setup, she said, is that corporate crime is pursued nationally through the DOJ's Criminal Division Fraud Section and through individual U.S. attorneys' offices. But it is difficult for ad hoc task forces like these to coordinate policy among a vast array of offices, and these agencies ought to be replaced by one corporate crimes division as a permanent base in the DOJ to combat waves of corporate criminality. Such a division would more effectively investigate and prosecute crimes of national and multinational corporations, and that would span many, many districts. It would also pursue a coordinated policy and send a signal that this was important to the government to fight large-scale corporate crime. This crime costs taxpayers billions, increases the cost of capital to honest businesses, and undermines the confidence of citizens in the rule of law. Given the cost of corporate crime, as Ramirez added, creating the division would promote superior institutional design that would yield substantial benefit. Let's talk about some of the costs of economic crime. She cited some measures saying that economic crime of this type vastly outweighs the cost of street crime, by measures ranging anywhere from 10 to 1 to 50 to 1. She cited one academic study that compared corporate crime costs of $250 billion annually, while street crime carried a cost of $4 billion. As if these figures are not high enough, there are additional but unknown costs associated with a relaxed approach to prosecuting white-collar crime. Those are the costs of similar, repeat episodes in the future. Because, as Ms. Ramirez pointed out, failing to prosecute criminal activity only guarantees that it will happen again, and probably on a larger scale next time. Now, one of the more disturbing aspects of deferred prosecutions is the degree to which federal investigators delegate their scrutiny of bad behavior to law firms hired by companies to conduct internal probes into misconduct. The way that these deals work is government lawyers now go to companies earlier in an inquiry and often task the companies with figuring out if improper activities have occurred. These companies then hire law firms to investigate and report back to the government. The alternative, of course, is for prosecutors to do their own in-depth investigations and present their findings to the grand jury. But this new tactic of outsourcing investigations, as some lawyers call it, has led to an increased coziness between companies and the government. Some defense lawyers say it is easier for companies to persuade prosecutors that they did nothing wrong because the investigators have become more dependent on others to do their legwork are less knowledgeable and thus less likely to counter with evidence that they themselves have uncovered. The process is also a cloaked one, critics say. The Justice Department does not disclose any details about its decision-making in specific cases, such as why it did not charge individuals at a company. A crucial problem with this outsourcing, and one that surprised me immensely in my interviews with the Justice Department, is that there does not seem to be any process in place at the DOJ to vet or review these internal reports produced by corporate law firms. Prosecutors rely on them, but they do not investigate the reports independently. In fact, they seem to rubber stamp them, never verifying whether the probes actually caught every single misstep at the company and every single miscreant. Many well-known companies have, of course, benefited from deferred prosecutions. In 2004, the American International Group, the giant insurer that the taxpayers bailed out so munificently in September of 2008, paid $126 million when it entered into an agreement to settle claims that it had helped clients improperly burnish their financial statements. Deals over accounting improprieties also were struck that year by Computer Associates, a technology company, and in 2005 by Bristol Myers Squibb, a pharmaceutical concern. Prudential Financial struck such an agreement in 2006 over improper mutual fund trading. Now, adding insult to injury, in most of these cases, the company's shareholders were the ones who paid the bills associated with deferred prosecutions. Requiring innocents to pay the freight for bad conduct by managers is just like requiring taxpayers to pay for the reckless practices of large and private financial institutions. It's called privatizing gains and socializing losses, and we are well acquainted with it. While a lot of people would like to see perpetrators get jail time for any role that they played during the years leading up to the crisis, it is not clear that this is the only punishment that might be desirable or that might make sense. Clawing back compensation that executives overseeing these disasters received during the boom times is another very good idea. But even this has not been done during the debacle. Yes, many executives saw their stock holdings decline significantly when their companies foundered. But they had already taken so much money out in the prior years that could be retrieved by prosecutors. That would send a powerful message, I think, to future perpetrators. There is no doubt that the failure to hold central figures accountable for actions that contributed to the financial crisis sets a very dangerous precedent. I am not the only one who is disturbed that so many who contributed to the mess, especially those in Washington, are still in positions of power or have risen to an even higher rank. And while some architects of the crisis may no longer command center stage, they remain respected members of the business community and/or the regulatory community. A system where perpetrators of such a crime are allowed to slip quietly from the scene is a recipe for anarchy and chaos. In the end, analyzing the financial crisis, its origins, and its framers requires identifying powerful participants who would obviously rather not be named. It requires connecting dots that appear unrelated and identifying events that seemed meaningless when they occurred, but that have turned out to be integral to this woeful outcome. It requires an unrelenting search for the facts, an ability to speak truth to power. Investigating the origins of the financial crisis means shedding light on exceedingly dark corners in Washington and Wall Street. Hidden in these shadows are people, places, and incidents that can help us understand the nature of this disaster so that we can keep anything like it from happening again. And yet, those investigations have not been forthcoming. I think that fact has done a lot to feed the abundant anger and mistrust among Americans today. Obviously, I'm not only talking about trust in private institutions like banks and other corporations. I'm also referring to the trust that has been lost by those in our government. The credit crisis was a two-pronged failure, after all. First was the failure by the private sector to rein itself in or to limit itself to appropriate business practices. The profits from reckless activities were simply too tantalizing and titanic to pass up for many of the executives running these institutions. The take the money and run mentality ran truly amok. But second, and equally important, was the abysmal regulatory performance. While Citigroup, for example, was amassing its mountain of bad assets, regulators at the New York Fed, overseen by Tim Geithner, now our Treasury Secretary, were loosening the reins on the company. And the failure by people at the highest levels of our regulatory system to even understand the risky practices that were being pursued by some of the nation's largest banks was nothing short of breathtaking. This inability to recognize peril when it was staring them in the face meant that Ben Bernanke and his colleagues were far behind when the subprime crisis began to metastasize. Trust, as we all know, is hard won and easily lost, and a great deal of it has been squandered in the recent failures and bailouts. The question that remains to be answered, and I hope will be tackled by ethicists and others perhaps in later programs this summer here at Dartmouth, is why did greed go so very viral during this period? I wonder if part of an explanation isn't lying in a rejection by some business leaders of that very powerful social compact, a duty to others rather than just to self. That compact used to be embraced by business leaders. People in positions of power recognized that they held immense sway over investors, workers, customers, and they agreed to hold themselves to a higher standard of care. This was particularly true in the financial companies. It was an unwritten rule, perhaps, but it seems to have now been supplanted by a notion that personal profits are supreme, and that making it to the top means having the biggest bank account. I don't know exactly how we recover this attention to duty. I don't know how to force people in high places to forego profits for propriety. I know that those of us in the media can do our part by shining light on the dark corners where such behavior often flourishes. faced with so many woeful stories of the people harmed by the Great Recession, I concede that it's difficult to be optimistic about our future and what kind of a country we will leave to our children and grandchildren. But America, as the land of opportunity, accountability, and honesty, has not vanished. It has been temporarily subverted, perhaps, and has taken some very damaging body blows. But the traits, the traits that made this country great, hard work, selflessness, honor, are still very much in us. We've just lived through a period when these traits weren't rewarded. To regain confidence after enduring this mess, I believe that at least some of the people who blew up these institutions must be held accountable for their actions. Investors, pensioners, employees, taxpayers, all have been harmed by reckless risk-taking at the highest level of some of these companies. It will be beyond exasperating if the people who created this disaster and profited mightily from it are allowed to slink off into the night. Then we will have confirmed the suspicion that the paths of the powerful are protected, that the little guy is left to fend for himself. Frédéric Bastiat was a French economic journalist who lived in the first half of the 19th century. As he said, quote, "When plunder becomes a way of life for a group of men living together in society, they create for themselves in the course of time a legal system that authorizes it and a moral code that glorifies it." End quote. Mr. Bastiat was right. I can only hope that such a system and such a code has not become the American way. Thank you very much for your attention. Well, they're looking at the questions that you've raised for me, and I'm delighted to see a stack about this big. So I'm really happy to have at least engendered some queries from you, which I'm happy to address after I speak for a little bit longer on a related topic, somewhat related to the financial crisis, certainly on the subject of the financial crisis, and that I think is related to the problems of few prosecutions, which I outlined during the last session. If those trends in prosecutions aren't disturbing enough, I think that they have unfortunately been somewhat compounded by weaknesses in the regulation that was crafted by Congress almost exactly a year ago to respond to the financial crisis and to ensure that such a cataclysm would never happen again. I mean, to a degree, I would say that if we are not going to get a lot of prosecutions, at least let's hope that we're safe and sound from these kinds of practices going forward because of the new and improved regulatory framework. But I'm unfortunately here not to say that that is absolutely the case. The Dodd-Frank legislation is really just one of the many paradoxes that has characterized this entire episode. That the law that was intended to protect taxpayers from future harm by reckless private sector and a feckless regulatory structure has done very little to address what I think are some of the biggest causes of the crisis. Now, you can ask me, how on earth can a piece of legislation that runs to 1,500 pages not address every last problem that we have? But unfortunately, that is the case, technically called the Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act. I think lawmakers gave it that name for a very good reason. As we know, the financial mess that Dodd-Frank was designed to clean up was the result of a pervasive corruption on Wall Street and an almost unfathomable fleecing of borrowers and other consumers by what I call the financial industrial complex. But I think if we are going to assume, or would like to assume, that this legislation lives up to its name, we have to ask some tough questions. Yes, the legislation is encyclopedic, but it is still has many loopholes and acres of wiggle room for the very participants that brought us our problems. So while it was praised as the most sweeping financial legislation since the Great Depression, it is in fact a complex and flawed law that does little to eliminate the largest problems that have arisen in world markets. The failings of this mind-bogglingly massive law are all the more perplexing when we recall that Glass-Steagall, the Depression-era legislation that protected consumers ably from abusive bankers until it was abolished by Congress in 1999, consisted of 32 pages. Setting Dodd-Frank and Glass-Steagall side by side, I'm afraid that I'm here to say less is more. There are lots of good aspects to the Dodd-Frank law. For example, it forces the highly secretive Federal Reserve to open up more about its operations. It requires the Fed to disclose who taps the discount window for money, albeit years after they've done so. The law has already reduced costs associated with getting a mortgage, eliminating some of the junk fees that banks had buried in the fine print of loan documents. And Dodd-Frank has also mandated a greater focus on consumer issues, an area that regulators had little interest in last time around. Moreover, derivatives, such as credit default swaps, will be traded more transparently on exchanges or clearinghouses, thereby shining some light on what had been a very dark and profitable corner of Wall Street. But the law's shortcomings are in fact quite serious, and I'd like to discuss three key areas where Dodd-Frank does not live up to the lofty goals set out in its full and formal name. The first of Dodd-Frank's lapses comes in its comprehension delegation of duties to regulators. Back in the old days, in the Depression, for example, lawmakers actually wrote legislation designed to protect investors and consumers. They identified problems and came up with solutions. Not so with Dodd-Frank. It assigned regulators much of the responsibility to reform Wall Street and protect consumers. Indeed, the law required regulators to create almost 400 new rules, conduct 67 studies, and issue 22 periodic reports. Now, there was an argument, and a good one, for handing off these duties to regulators. It was that securities and commodities cops and banker overseers are more familiar than Congress with the ins and outs of the businesses that they oversee. As a result, the view was that these regulators would be in a much better position to write more effective rules for industry to follow. Now, this does sound reasonable, but it is a problematic approach for 3 reasons. First, I think it's a dereliction of duty by lawmakers and evidence of an increasing trend in Congress to shuffle off the nuts and bolts work, the really heavy lifting that's supposed to be done by our elected officials, to others who are appointed, not elected. The second problem, it delegates this crucial task of resolving financial industry problems to some of the very same people who failed to see them when they were staring them in the face. The SEC, the Comptroller of the Currency, the Federal Reserve, all snoozed throughout the mortgage mania. Why should any taxpayer believe that the people charged with doing the pivotal work of Dodd-Frank will perform more ably than they did in the years leading up to the crisis? But even more sinister, this delegation to regulators of designing Dodd-Frank's mechanical workings, very crucial mechanical workings, gives financial services lobbyists a second chance to influence the law's final outcome. Even as we speak, regulators are being sweet-talked, pummeled, manipulated by lobbyists to write the rules in a way that favors them and their big bank clients. As a result, these powerful institutions, some of the same ones that drove our economy into the ditch, are getting another opportunity to formulate the rules they will have to abide by. They get 2 bites of the Dodd-Frank apple and are definitely using it to their advantage. Here's an example. On the important business of derivatives trading, in which Dodd-Frank was supposed to ensure that all instruments trade in the full light of day, the law created a loophole. It gave the Treasury Secretary the right to determine whether foreign exchange swaps could be exempt from the exchange trading requirement. This is a huge market. Some $4 trillion of these instruments change hands every day on world markets. I don't need to tell you that the big banks that profit so mightily from trading these swaps in the dark positively swarmed the Treasury Department, trying to ensure that Tim Geithner make the move that they prefer. Between November of 2010 and last January, for example, Treasury officials met with 34 representatives of large financial institutions to talk about foreign exchange swaps. During that time, Treasury officials met just once with a representative of the public who was arguing that these swaps should be traded on exchanges or clearinghouses. 34-1. Given this onslaught, it's perhaps not surprising that Mr. Geithner sided with the banks on this issue, and thereby undermining a large part of Dodd-Frank's claim to protecting investors. He ruled that foreign exchange swaps should be exempt from the new transparency rules. It was his view that because foreign exchange swaps had not been a crucial part of the financial crisis, that they should be allowed to continue to be traded behind closed doors. Now, that's just one area where delegation of the inner workings of Dodd-Frank has been assigned to regulatory officials. There are literally hundreds more that are being hammered out as we speak. Many deadlines for new rules to be imposed by the Dodd-Frank law have already been missed. As my Times colleague Louise Story reported earlier this spring, 28 of the financial overhaul rulemaking deadlines have been missed. Of the 385 new rules to be written, regulators have completed only 24 requirements. They were supposed to have taken 41 such actions by now. Michael Greenberger, a law professor at the University of Maryland and a former official at the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, characterized the delays as a strategy by the entities that are to be regulated. He said, "There is an attempt to kill this through delay. The difference between 8 or 9 months and 24 months could be cataclysmic here," he added. Now, efforts to slow down the rulemaking process have been especially aggressive in the derivatives area. Once again, an immensely profitable area for the small group of large banks that control this market. They have argued that the government should allow a slow pace of changes for rewriting these important contracts. Retreating to one of their favorite arguments, the banks say that rules written by regulators in the U.S. should not differ from those in other markets, such as the European markets. Then they also make the tired claim that jobs will be lost if we put strong regulations in place. The point is that regulators in the United States overseeing this process tell us it's difficult to tell how many of the concerns of financial executives and their lobbyists are valid and which ones are exaggerated. This takes time for them to sort out, and they are outmanned and outgunned. Financial firms say that the slower deliberations may lead to sounder and smarter outcomes. Some lawmakers agree, and some voted in recent weeks in congressional committees to delay derivatives rules at least a year. Many of those rules were supposed to have been completed by this one-year anniversary of the Dodd-Frank bill. Regulators have been swamped by public comments and asked for more funds and personnel to meet the demands. In April, the Commodities Future Trading Corporation extended all of its derivative comment periods for a month. While nobody wants rules written in a hurry, it is almost certain that the bank's access to regulators will skew the rules more in their favor. The fact is, Main Street has few, if any, advocates sitting at the table when these rules are being worked out. The second area where Dodd-Frank fell down was in its complete avoidance of how to resolve the big mortgage zombies, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Already these two giants have cost taxpayers $153 billion, and this tab continues to grow. Estimates vary on what the failure of these two companies might actually cost ultimately. While Treasury officials boast about how much money they have earned on the TARP program, the Fannie and Freddie front is a different story. Clearly, it's crucial to resolve these two companies that are propping up the nation's mortgage finance industry today. And yet, Dodd-Frank was silent on how to do so. Still, these avoidance techniques are questionable, I think, for any leader, and resolving Fannie and Freddie will have to be topic A this year. Discussions about how these companies might look in the future, whether they should be wound down or constructed in a completely different manner, are discussions that have really already begun. But Dodd-Frank, the most sweeping financial legislation in more than 70 years, did not touch on the problems associated with these companies. The third missing feature of Dodd-Frank, I think, is the most glaring and crucial, and that is the law did nothing to eliminate the threat of institutions that are too big and politically powerful to be allowed to fail. Even though the existence and clout of such institutions were directly responsible for the financial panic of 2008 and its attendant economic woes, too big to fail is alive and well in America. Indeed, according to a recent Bloomberg article, the largest U.S. banks have grown bigger since the financial crisis. And too big to fail banks will increase by 40% in size over the next 15 years, this article said. This is because although Dodd-Frank bars the nation's biggest banks from merging with one another, it does not stop the institutions from growing in other ways. The banking sector grew 7 times faster than gross domestic product since the beginning of the financial crisis, Bloomberg said. Today, the top 10 banks in the U.S. hold 77% of all bank assets, compared with 55% of total U.S. assets in 2002. This increase has also outpaced inflation every decade since the 1930s, when total assets in the banking system were first recorded. Tom Honig, the former president of the Kansas City Federal Reserve Bank, is among the few policymakers willing to speak out about the continuing problem of big and powerfully interconnected financial institutions. In a speech last year, he said, "The existence of these institutions poses the single greatest risk to the U.S. economy," and noted that incentives for risk-taking have not been curbed. He also said that the regulatory factors that helped to create the crisis remain firmly in place. Mr. Honig advocates breaking up big banks, a message you will hear neither in Washington nor on Wall Street. Dodd-Frank also supplies another loophole that will allow even the largest banks to buy troubled institutions, albeit in times of crisis. This would only grow the size and peril of these institutions. A section of the law lets big banks, even those who are subject to the normal limits on concentration of assets that the law provides, it allows them to buy failing banks if regulators approve the deals. Can you imagine a regulator saying no to such a deal when the next crisis hits? Perhaps even more surprising, Dodd-Frank helped to create a new set of institutions that will almost certainly be deemed too important to fail if they ever get into trouble. And that means there won't really be an effective way from keeping these firms from taking big and profitable short-term risks that may be dumped on the taxpayers when their bets fail. Topping this list of new bailout candidates are the derivatives clearinghouses, which were set up under Dodd-Frank to increase the oversight of trading in these instruments. Because most derivatives transactions are expected to go through clearinghouses, they will be considered systemically important institutions under the law. As such, Dodd-Frank specifically provides that in unusual or exigent circumstances, the Federal Reserve may provide such entities, the systemically important entities, with a financial backstop, including borrowing privileges. Financial backstop is just another term for taxpayer bailout. And the major banks and brokerage firms are the members of the clearinghouses, so a backstop would essentially be for them. According to the Bank for International Settlements, the entire derivatives market had a gross credit exposure of $3.5 trillion in 2010. Obviously, Even a small fraction of that amount could represent a sizable call on the taxpayers if a clearinghouse hit the skids. Another disappointing aspect of Dodd-Frank is that it conferred special status on institutions that are seen as systemically important. For example, the process to resolve big bank failures is specifically targeted to, well, big banks. Smaller institutions, by contrast, will be allowed to go bankrupt without a new resolution scheme. This special resolution system is not only unfair, it also sends a pernicious signal to the market about large and interconnected institutions. Subject as they will be to the newly codified resolution authority, these institutions and their investors and lenders can expect to be rescued if they get into trouble. This perception delivers lucrative advantages to these institutions, the main perquisite being lower borrowing costs. This is a result, of course, of lenders' assumptions that the giants are less risky because they will be in line for government assistance if they become imperiled. Think Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, both of which assured taxpayers routinely throughout the 90s and early 2000s that they would never cost us a dime. In spite of these Dodd-Frank failings, taxpayers have been told repeatedly that the law ends too big to fail. But market participants well know that these large institutions will in fact be rescued if they get themselves into trouble. Why would they think otherwise? Indeed, there is some truth to the argument that all Dodd-Frank did as regards too big to fail banks was to institutionalize government bailouts. Even the rarely perspicacious credit rating agencies recognize that government support for big institutions is here to stay. In January, S&P said that when rating banks, it would now include the prospect of government rescues as a factor in determining the grades they receive. Moody's quickly followed suit, stating that the resolution regime proposed by Dodd-Frank, quote, will not work as planned, posing a contagion risk and most likely forcing the government to provide support to avoid a systemic crisis, end quote. As a result, Moody's said it would assume government support for the nation's 8 largest banking organizations. Before the crisis, we had 2 too big to fail institutions, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Now we have 8. And so the 1,500 pages of Dodd-Frank verbiage have left us, I think, perilously close to where we were before the credit crisis hit. We're still faced with the possibility that wide swaths of derivatives will be traded behind the scenes and in the shadows. We have no resolution plan for Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. The regulators who are hammering out Dodd-Frank are being subjected to immense lobbying pressure. Most significant, we remain threatened by institutions that are too big to succeed. This is certainly not where I hoped we would be 4 years after the crisis began. But here we are. And what I think it means is that while Glass-Steagall protected Americans for almost 70 years, the flaws in Dodd-Frank may guarantee that the next crisis will come sooner rather than later. I think that we, the people, understand this well. A poll of 804 likely voters that was released yesterday by the AARP indicates that by a margin of 2 to 1, those polled want financial institutions to be subject to increased government oversight. 77% said they wanted Wall Street to face tougher regulations, a view that crossed party lines, by the way. while 88% of Democrats polled believe Wall Street should face greater scrutiny. They were joined by 74% of independents and 70% of Republicans. Respondents also overwhelmingly object to the canard that increased regulation will be a job killer and impede the economic recovery. 2/3 of those polled rejected this notion. The American people understand that we have just lived through a crisis that came about because unfettered risk-taking with an eye to huge personal paydays gained the upper hand in corporate executive suites and on Wall Street trading floors. They also understand that regulators who were supposed to be minding the store were captured by the institutions they were charged with policing. This makes it all the more crucial that the rules created by the Dodd-Frank legislation be effective, tough, and also allow regulators who failed at their job to be held accountable. It almost seems as if many in our government do not want us to know what went wrong and why, or who the perpetrators were. But until we can get a complete picture, we will not be able to know how to prevent such a disaster from recurring. And that, I think, should be our nation's #1 goal. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to take questions.
I hope you brought lunch. We're going to be here for a while. No bathroom breaks until all the questions are answered.
No.
There are some general themes, Gretchen, so we'll try to throw out some of the general ones and then go through later. One that seemed to run through a lot of was, please comment on the extent to which the behavior in this financial crisis was actually criminal, like in the legal sense, or was it just, is the majority of it just actually morally wrong but maybe legal?
Well, this is, of course, the question that is very central to the question of why there have not been any prosecutions, and I regret to say that I am not a lawyer, and so I can't answer that question authoritatively. Neither have I been a party to the investigations that were conducted by the SEC, the DOJ, et cetera. But I guess that my feeling is that it's hard to believe, it's sort of incredible that something this big and expansive and damaging and destructive was nobody's fault. You know, you know, people say, well, it was maybe a tsunami or an act of God. Well, it was an act of man, actually. And so it's hard to imagine that there are not cases that can be made to pursue those acts. I think we're in even worse condition if, in fact, something this large and this expansive and destructive could, in fact, go on without any illegality. Because if that's the case, then it will certainly happen again, and the taxpayer will once again be on the hook. So I can't answer definitively and provide cases which should have been made, or you know, actual illegal actions that should have been pursued. But I will say that the case involving Angelo Mozillo is one that many prosecutors have spoken to me about with dismay and perhaps a little suspicion. This was a case that was brought by the SEC, as is its custom, and the Justice Department out in Los Angeles was also investigating Mr. Mozillo and some of his lieutenants for the stock sales that they made. It was an insider trading case predominantly, for the stock sales that they made while the mania was still ongoing, but while internal emails showed that they were concerned about their lending practices. And quotes from some of the emails were delightful. Angelo Mozillo calling his company's loans poison and toxic and the worst loans I've ever seen, things like that. So with these emails out in the public domain after the SEC brought its case, it was confounding, I think, to many people that the Department of Justice in Los Angeles decided to stand down and not prosecute. You know, here was Angelo making public statements that investors were relying upon throughout the period. Oh, the company's doing great, the company's solid financially, the company does not make subprime loans, he even said. And yet internally there were these emails that were obviously saying the opposite. That seems to me a pretty cut and dried case. And the fact that he was selling $500 million worth of stock during the period could also be a pretty good insider trading case. But the SEC simply slapped him on the wrist, requiring him to pay, I think it was $50 million, but most of that was paid by Bank of America. He paid $22 million of his own money. I'm happy to write that check, I'm sure. And the Department of Justice closed its case without bringing a case. So that is the one that I think mystifies people the most. And I think it, you know, we just don't know the answer to the question of why that particular case against Countrywide, a company that is still, to this day, having a huge negative impact on Bank of America, which took it over, why that case really died on the vine.
That led us to another thing in our topic of corruption. Relates some of the lack of prosecutorial zeal to the sort of hand-in-glove relationship we have with Congress, committees, PACs, donations to campaigns, fundraising, and things of that nature.
Well, you know, the Department of Justice is supposed to be above all that. They're not, you know, part of the, they're not elected officials, of course. And every prosecutor that I speak to, even those that are as dismayed as I am about this, say, we can't understand it because these guys want to win cases, because winning cases is important for them to then go into the private sector and make a lot of money and, you know, have a successful career. And I get that. I understand that that's the motivation. And so that's an, you know, an additional question that remains unanswered as to why the cases either are brought badly or not brought at all. So, I mean, it's hard for me to throw the Department of Justice in with the moneyed interests and their control of Washington, which certainly has everything to do with how regulations are made and how certainly these Dodd-Frank rules are being devised. I think the lobbying is frenetic in those areas and very, you know, going to be very crucial to the outcome. But it's hard for me to believe that the DOJ is a part of that cabal. I think that would be pretty devastating if that were, in fact, to be the case. They're supposed to be completely independent. So, yes, Washington is exceedingly dysfunctional, but I would, you know, unless I had proof, and that would be a hell of a story, that the DOJ was standing down because of campaign contributions, I'm just not willing to go to that level of, I don't know what, dark thought.
Okay, little editorial comments if you can. To what extent or what should, you know, we've raised the problem today. We've identified it's very deep, very complex. To what would be your recommendation for, I guess, as a society first, to go ahead and try to fix this problem?
That's a good one. How about throwing all the bums out in Washington? And, It's very difficult. We have no say, we have no voice, we have no seat at the table. It really does appear, now we know that lobbying has gone on since time began, but it does really feel that the moneyed interests are in control, do hold sway, are driving the dynamic, driving the conversation and dialogue to a greater degree than they used to. One of the data points that I was really shocked at was after the crisis, sort of after the stock market had bottomed in March of 2009 and started to climb back, and we started to, feel like maybe the world wasn't going to come to an end. It was shocking to me how aggressive the financial institutions were in their lobbying in Washington. They were swanning around Washington like they had no shame, like they hadn't just created the biggest economic cataclysm, in 70 years. They were operating as business as usual. It was just an amazing kind of moment that showed me that these were institutions that didn't understand, that were maybe in denial, whatever, but that's probably being kind, but that did not understand that there should be a thing called shame here, that they should stay in their hole for at least a given amount of time and not come back and have the temerity to go around trying to throw money at politicians who could make a difference for them. It was amazing to me. So what can we do? Okay. I think as investors, there is a real role to play for people to reject executives who behave badly, who get paid enormously. If you own shares in a company, vote no. I do that in the companies whose shares I own. It's mutual fund companies because I'm not allowed to own specific stocks, but I vote no just to say, hi, I'm out there and I'm watching you, and if you're not doing what I think is the right thing to do, people think that this is meaningless, they don't pay attention to this. I think that's not true. I think corporate America does pay attention to its investors, even if you only own 100 shares. There was an interesting story that I wrote in a column earlier this year about sort of an investor group that got together on the internet to collect a large number of shareholders to vote no against a company's directors and their pay plan. And they actually got together a bunch, I think it was about 4 million shares. And so, there are ways to kind of act together as concerned citizens that do make an impact on some of these companies. So I think that feeling like you're helpless and unable to change things, I think is not a good approach. I think just keep hammering, keep writing to your congressman, keep saying no, keep writing to the CEO whose pay you object to or whose practices you think are problematic. They do get read, they do get listened to, I believe. You're not going to change the world overnight, but I think that it's being proactive is a more optimistic approach. It certainly beats feeling helpless and, unable to make any kind of a change. But, it really does, I think, boil down to the dysfunction in Washington, and it's hard to really see how that dynamic can be changed. I would love to hear opinions from you people about it. I just don't know what to do. I'm just glad I'm not a political reporter, so I don't have to, operate in that cesspool all the time. Wall Street's kind of a kindergarten compared to Washington.
Your initial response, which is usually how you really feel, one of the cards I got said, "Should we take them all out and hang them?" So I think you're somewhere between here and there.
Well, I think it was a bad thing when we got rid of the stocks that you used to put people in the middle of town. I think there's a lot to be said for, humiliation and public sort of demonstrations of guilt.
Okay. And to get to kind of the cause, there were a lot of questions saying we have this situation of bankers making a lot of bonuses by lending money they shouldn't lend to people who shouldn't borrow it. But you also, if you go the other way, you have people who are borrowing money that they shouldn't be borrowing to buy things that they really don't afford. Do you think, is it a combination of everything, the regulation, the lenders lending to people they shouldn't, the people borrowing when they shouldn't, or is there one group that's more to blame, I guess you would say, would be concentrated in one area?
Yeah, a lot of people say, you know, oh, the greedy borrower created the crisis, and there were a lot of greedy borrowers. But my response to the greedy borrower created the crisis accusation is twofold. First, when a borrower received a mortgage, during the mania, when all of these cockamamie mortgages were being produced, interest-only mortgages, mortgages in which you could decide what amount of interest you wanted to pay, home equity lines of credit that were based on a wildly inflated home value. When all of these contracts were being agreed to by the lenders and by the borrowers signed a document that was to go to the IRS so that the lender could check the borrower's income. It was routine. To this day, if you take out a mortgage, you will sign something called a 4506T, and it's an IRS document that the lender sends to the IRS so that the IRS can give the lender your income. Of course, otherwise the IRS will not provide that information. So every liar loan, every interest-only loan, every loan given to a person who was flipping burgers at McDonald's and who claimed $300,000 in income, signed a 4506T, which was supposed to have been sent to the IRS by the lender. The lender didn't want to know. I had an interview with a man who, in the heat of the mania, or as it was building up, had set up a business to facilitate this process. His business was going to be, he was going to be the guy that was going to take all these documents, forward them all to the IRS electronically, have the IRS get back to them with the accurate income level, and then he would provide that information to the banks, easing the banks' paperwork problem. His phone never rang because the banks didn't want to know. So to me, that's a very telling example of who was really culpable here. Okay, if I want to lie about my income to get a loan, shame on me, but if you're the lender and you have the ability to catch me in that lie and you choose not to, then doubly shame on you. The point is, the lender didn't care because they were selling the mortgage to somebody else. If they were going to keep it on their books, you can be sure they would have called this fellow who was going to facilitate this process or sent the material to the IRS, but they didn't because they were selling the loans as fast as they could to investors who bought mortgage securities. So that's one answer to the question of who I think is more culpable. What was the other one now? I can't remember. That one is such a good one. I get this all the time about the greedy borrower. I mean, one thing I think we should remember, this is the second point, is that during the late 90s, early 2000s, real incomes were either stagnant or declined. You heard about stories about people taking home equity loans out on their homes and going to Paris or buying a Mercedes or, buying another house and speculating on that real estate. But for the vast majority of people, I think that the home equity lines of credit that they took out on their homes as they went up in value was about maintaining a style or maintaining a life that they had been leading when incomes were still rising. Incomes declined from 1998 or were stagnant from 1998 on for 10 years until the crisis, and now, of course, they're even more troubled. So for all the people who went to Europe on their home equity lines, for all the people who borrowed on their inflated home value to buy a Viking stove, I think there were probably 10 people who were just doing it to put their kids through college, to pay a health care bill, or to put food on the table. And so my feeling about the greedy borrower is that we had a period of time when incomes were falling, and this was a way for people to pick up the slack.
Okay, good. Our group, more than any other group that you might give a presentation to, is kind of long on memories of how these things get caused. About evenly split about where do you feel the problems began, or do you feel it's been an evolution? Was it Reaganomics, the Clinton policies, the Bush policies, or Obama not handling the situation?
Well, I think it's a continuum. I think it certainly begins with the Reagan's view that regulation was automatically a problem, automatically wrong, automatically to be eliminated, and that the government was the problem, not the solution. So I think that the story sort of starts there, but you know, I think that it was this push for home ownership that President Clinton really instigated in '94 and '95, where he enlisted a collaborative effort with regulators, industry, you know, especially banking, and the government to really, you know, help push the rate of home ownership to what then we understood were unnatural levels. I think that was really the turning point that got us into the feeding frenzy that took us, you know, to where we are now. Obviously, the appetite for regulation was declining, you know, from the Reagan period on. It was also, though, under Clinton that Glass-Steagall was finally abandoned. And, you know, there's a moment where the law was called Gramm-Leach-Bliley that ultimately did Glass-Steagall in. You know, lawmakers, there's a picture in, that ran in one of the papers of Clinton smiling. He's being surrounded by Alan Greenspan, you know, a lot of lawmakers, regulators. They're all smiling very broadly when he's signing this legislation that really drives a stake through this very effective regulation that had been in place since the Depression. And there was a party afterwards where there was a cake that had the words Glass-Steagall RIP on it. So this was legislation that was not designed to improve the world. It was designed to, you know, get rid of an old set of rules. So that occurred in, you know, 1999. And so it's hard not to take a look at Clinton and say that this was a very, very integral part of his strategy. At the time, of course, we were, experiencing immense good fortune. The stock market was roaring. The government had a surplus. Hard to believe. They stopped issuing the 30-year bond because they didn't feel like they needed to have that kind of borrowing capacity. So, you know, it's a really huge, you know, 180 from where we are now. But these things do take quite a while to transpire. So it's a continuum. I mean, I certainly don't lay it at the feet of Obama at all. It was not his creation, this problem. But I think that, you know, he's got a lot on his plate. He's not a financially aware, or he's not an expert on financial matters. And I think that he left it to some of the same people who were involved in these issues leading up to the crisis, and that was a mistake for him because he then sort of started to own the problem by inviting Larry Summers in to, you know, provide economic guidance. I think that was a real signal that, you know, he was kind of in the same, using the same group of people who had years before affected many of the policies that brought this thing to fruition. So his is a mistake of commission of the people that he surrounded himself with. Certainly not the crisis itself. That is certainly not his his problem. The Bush administration absolutely was all for home ownership, obviously encouraged the same home ownership push, the same deregulatory push, absolutely, and of course, Alan Greenspan is to be faulted immensely by having kept interest rates too low for too long, which created this massive bubble in real estate.
In the current hot legal political topic is the raising the national debt ceiling. And is there any way through your research, is there any estimates that you've come across as the cost of this financial crisis to the national debt? Would it be something that if we had done something, is it a magnanimous numbers that would have lowered the debt somewhat?
It's hard to say. I mean, the only actual numbers we have are the costs of various programs, and even some of those costs are really not accessible. And I just think this is one of those episodes where the total cost and the total accounting is not going to be evident for a very long time. Well, of course, we have Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac into the taxpayer to $154 billion. We still have $30 billion of Bear Stearns assets at the Federal Reserve Bank in New York. We still have, I think, some assets of AIG to get rid of. I mean, this is a long-term accounting, and so when people say that, you know, banks repaid TARP and gave the government a profit on that, I think that that's really dishonest, because we haven't really had the total accounting yet, and we can't possibly do so. But I would say that the largest cost of all is this continuation of too big to fail, because what it means is that when the future crisis hits, once again the taxpayer will be on the hook. And so while we can't say right now that this episode is going to cost us $2 trillion, $500 billion, whatever the number is, we certainly know that the next time around there will be further bailouts, and so that, to me, is the biggest cost, unknowable at this time, certainly unknowable until the next crisis hits. But we cannot have an accounting at the moment of how much this has cost us, but we can see it in the pain and suffering on Main Street, with the unemployment level, certainly the losses that were encountered by investors in mortgage-backed securities, many of whom are in mutual funds. You know, these are just large, these are significant costs, and it just has not, we just have not been able to total them yet.
In the 2008 meltdown, do you attribute any of the problems to the change from private partnerships to corporate form of investment banking, and the rating agencies and how they reacted?
That's a very good question, and I would agree wholeheartedly that one of the reasons that we had more investment banks or banks getting into trouble this time around was because they had become publicly traded companies with shareholders, and they were operating using other people's money. You did not see, for instance, Brown Brothers Harriman, which is still a private partnership on Wall Street, get involved in these mortgage securities, and you did not see Brown Brothers selling collateralized debt obligations that they were telling their customers were perfectly good, and meanwhile they were betting against them themselves in their own accounts. So I think that there was a, obviously when it's other people's money, there is going to be a natural, maybe more relaxed approach to minding the store. Then it's the partner's money. When it's the partner's money, you can be sure that they're going to be extremely careful, vigilant, and prudent about the bets and the investments that they make. So I think that's an absolutely crucial point to make, and Goldman Sachs is, of course, an example of this, because they were not always a public company. They were, in fact, a partnership for many, many years until the 90s. The other part of the question was, ratings agencies. That could be an entire day talking about the ratings agencies.
Maybe we could have you come back again.
Well, yeah, talk about a group that didn't get any damage done to them. I mean, it's just unbelievable. Talk about unaccountable. It's amazing. This group of people single-handedly, destroyed more investment dollars than perhaps anybody else, and they are still operating. People still follow what they say. They are still wreaking havoc when they threaten to downgrade. Now they're threatening to downgrade sovereign debt ratings. It is an abomination that they are continuing to do business in the same fashion that they did in this crisis. There's been some mea culpas, they go testify, they grovel, they pretend to be sorry, but the fact of the matter is their business model is exactly the same. Part of the problem with the ratings agencies is that the government, that regulators in their infinite wisdom really entrenched and embedded the ratings into the entire investment process. So we have to undo that if we are going to force investors to make their own analyses of these intricate securities. For instance, the SEC required that I think mutual funds, there are all these requirements. For instance, mutual funds, the money market funds can only invest in securities that carry a certain rating. Insurance companies can only buy debt obligations that have a certain rating of whatever, I think, investment grade or higher. And so this whole process was embedded in the system, which gave them immense credibility and power, and yet there was no accountability. The most amazing aspect of this lack of accountability is that the ratings agencies have successfully argued in legal cases that they write opinions like the press, and so therefore enjoy the same First Amendment protections that the New York Times does. And this has prevented them from being held accountable by litigants, by private litigants, who are trying to argue that because the ratings agencies were so crucial to the creation of these complex securities, like mortgage-backed securities or collateralized debt obligations, they were literally at the table advising Wall Street how to design these securities so as to receive AAA ratings. Many people have said, wait a minute, journalists aren't at the table when these decisions are being made. I am not privy to private information about companies when the decisions are being made. I have to get that my own way. But the ratings agencies are at the table, they're participants, hands-on players, and yet they have been able to argue that they have a First Amendment protection because what they are presenting is only an opinion. So that is a huge problem, because it's, again, one less way to hold them accountable.
Carrying that a little further on the journalistic, in your opinion, the journalistic community, television, radio, print, should they be doing more? Should they, or is there anything that could influence their opinions that they give? You're obviously out on the lead front as what they call attack dogs, but are there others? Should others be doing more? Do you think that should become an issue?
I wish there were more attack dogs alongside me, honestly. I mean, you don't want to be the only person out there doing these kinds of stories, and I'm certainly not the only person, but I wish I had company a lot of the time, because I think that it's been a distressing enough scenario and episode, and the media really did have a serious role to play in the years leading up to the crisis that they failed at pretty miserably. And I see less of that failure in the business section of the New York Times than I see elsewhere, but there is I wish there were more people who were willing to speak truth to power. There are a lot of journalists who prefer what I call the access route, which is that powerful people give them access, and so therefore there's a sort of an implicit understanding that the journalist will, respond and by doing favorable articles. This is a really important characteristic of Washington coverage, unfortunately. The access journalist in Washington is huge because there is so little in the public domain, believe it or not. FOIA is really a toothless thing. The Freedom of Information Act is really toothless. It really does not allow journalists in Washington to really get as much information as, for instance, I, as a business reporter, can get from Securities and Exchange Commission filings and other public documents that companies have to file every year. So Washington reporters are much more reliant on people leaking them information, and the unfortunate aspect of that is that the leaks usually carry a quid pro quo, and that you might have to, be nice to the person who gave you the leak. Now, I'm not saying this doesn't exist in business reporting. It does, but business reporting is a lot cleaner because there are so many more public filings and documents that I can gain access to, and so therefore I can get around the people who maybe don't want to participate or don't want to help me with my story. So I would say yes, that journalists, we need more journalists who are questioning. We need more, it doesn't have to be from a newspaper, it could be bloggers, could be on the internet, could be Huffington Post, could be whatever, but we need solid, factual, hard-hitting reporting that really shines the light on the dark corners, because otherwise we're just going to be completely clueless about who's doing what to whom and how it's going to affect you and me. So I would welcome any, help and journalist that wants to join me in the fight for truth and sunlight. There are a few of them, but I wish there were more.
Here's one. Several commentators have called the meltdown a one-gender crash. Do you think a more equal balance between men and women would help?
Wow. I wonder what gender person wrote that sort of thing. I don't know. I mean, there are obviously women at very high levels in many of these companies who, that got into problems. I'm certainly not a person who's going to say that if we had women running all these things, that it would be they would be better companies and better managed. But I'll tell you, the crisis was interesting because Sheila Bair was really one of the few grown-ups in the room when all of these things were happening. And she was kind of a no-nonsense person who just was really trying to protect the taxpayer, because her fund, although it's bank-funded, the FDIC Guarantee Fund, she understands that if it gets depleted, that might be a call on the taxpayer. She was really interested in that, and she was tough-minded about making demands when, the other, regulators and participants were sort of running around with their hair on fire saying, we've got to bail this one out, bail that one out, bail this one out. She was really trying to hold firm to make sure that the taxpayer was not hurt any more than they would have to be. So she was kind of an example of, the only grown-up being a female. But it's not something that I think we can say across the board. I would love to see more women in high places in, either the regulatory framework and certainly in business. There are a few CEOs that are women, but the numbers are still small. The numbers of directors who are women is still small. So I think we have a long way to go in evening out that scale. But it's interesting when you see people like Sheila Bair and maybe Elizabeth Warren, kind of really standing up and being a voice for the people like you and me. It does make people think. I've been asked that question before.
How does the sort of the slowdown in prosecution and things on the financial crisis, how does that have any relationship on a worldwide basis? Do you think that other financial markets, other countries are following the same example?
Does our crisis have a relationship to other crises?
Yes. Like, they're going through Greece or something.
Absolutely. We sold all these people our toxic garbage. That's for starters. That was our biggest export, mortgage-backed securities that had toxic loans in them. German banks failed because they bought a lot of our mortgage garbage. So yeah, no, there's definitely a relationship here. But we are obviously in way better shape than the European countries. Our banks appear to be, coming back from the dead and rebuilding some of their capital structure. And the European countries, I think, have a much greater, more systemic problem of getting people to pay their taxes and making ends meet and being able to live within their means. We have that problem ourselves right now, but we certainly have an economy that will help us get out of this mess. And it's not clear to me that some of these countries in Europe have economies or the structure of the economies is such that they will come out of their disastrous circumstances, in a kind of a quick fashion.
And regarding regulators and prosecutors, do you think there should be some way we should hold them accountable? And if so, who would be the person that would hold them accountable, or the group that would hold them accountable?
Yeah, it's one of these sort of maddening questions. You don't want to just keep adding more layers to the regulatory process if you don't think that it's going to make a difference. But it really is interesting that regulators who have failed significantly in their roles just really don't pay the price. They move on to some other place. They move on to the private sector. It really is wrong. I mean, I know if people make big mistakes in my business, they usually have a harder time getting hired, than just walking into another job. So it seems like there should be some sort of way for the taxpayers who ultimately pay these bills to hold regulators accountable. I'm just not sure how you would set that up, but I think that maybe there are some incentives that have to be put in place with their pay, and there has to be a way to do it that makes sense and that adds them to the list of people who really do have to perform, or else they will face the consequences.
We have a couple more. I thought we'd switch gears to a more journalism type things. What pressures or threats have you experienced to try and stop you from your journalistic investigations?
Let's see. Well, I've been threatened personally by a high-level Wall Street executive because of a story that I wrote about him, in which I basically argued that he was taking money under the table from a certain group of very low-rent brokerage firms to conduct business for them. This was a very high-level Bear Stearns executive, and he personally threatened me through his wife. By the way, he was cowardly enough that he made his wife do it. But anyway, it was interesting because I notified the district attorney about it because the district attorney of New York was investigating Bear Stearns, and they actually pursued the lead, and they discovered that the threat had been made, where the threat was made, how it was cooked up, and all of this. It was a telephone call, and it actually became part of the SEC case against Bear Stearns. It was fascinating. But it's not something that I take very seriously. I just do my job. I mean, they don't kill journalists in this country yet. They do in Russia, they do, of course, in China and other places, but we're lucky still to this day they don't. Being careful, being accurate. Having the New York Times behind me is huge, of course, but I get a lot of angry commentary. My superiors hear a lot from people who don't like what I do, and they are very, resounding in their support of me as long as I am accurate and as long as what I am doing is right. So I am held accountable in all of these cases. But I do get a lot of complaints. I am not the banker's favorite. I am not Lloyd Blankfein's favorite, but I don't really want to be their favorites. It's not about that for me. I don't want to go to their parties. I don't want to be inside their tent. I want to be on the outside looking in because that's my job.
Yeah, one final question was, how come you're not in the New York Times more often?
How come I'm not in the New York Times more often? Oh, well, I will be now that I'm no longer writing a book, and now that as soon as I can sit at my desk, chain myself down there and write a little bit more often than once a week, but I will certainly be back at it and trying to keep my readers happy. So thank you so much for your interest and your enthusiasm.